So hello everybody, we are Omar Munk and Ivano Malavolta from the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam, and we will be presenting our systematic mapping study on measurement-based experiments on the mobile web. So what we've seen is that the percentage of worldwide web traffic coming from mobile devices has grown significantly in the past decade and has even surpassed traffic coming from desktop devices. Now, together with this, we observe the evolution of the mobile web browser as a fully featured, almost operating system like software platform, thanks to the developments of the HTML5 specification, which gives mobile web apps almost native app-like functionality with APIs for geolocation, sensors, vibrations, push notification, etc., as you can see here. Now, because of these two trends, the expectations of users in the terms of quality of experience when browsing the web on a mobile device has really grown. And as a result, we also see the number of studies doing measurement-based experiments to investigate the factors influencing this quality of experiments have also increased. And the thing is that, conducting these measurement-based experiments is not a trivial task. So in this study, our aim is to build a map of existing studies that conduct these measurement-based experiments to help researchers and practitioners to properly design and execute such experiments themselves. And we will do that by looking at 4 different things. So which metrics are collected in these experiments, how are they measured and how are they analyzed, the platforms considered on which the experiments are run, the subject use, and finally the use tools, environments, and conditions under which the experiments were executed. Now, the design of our mapping study consisted of 3 different phases. During the search and selection phase, we collected papers doing actual measurement-based experiments on the mobile web. And we started with an initial search where we performed a query on Google Scholar using a predetermined search string targeting the title of papers. And this resulted in 232 potential primary studies. Then we applied the selection criteria, which you can see in the slide, on these papers. And a paper was added to the set of primary studies when it met all of the inclusion criteria and none of the exclusion criteria. So after evaluating all the papers, a total of 10 studies met the actual selection criteria. But to enlarge the set of relevant studies, we applied both backward and forward snowballing to the 10 previously found papers. And this led to 408 new studies, which we again applied the selection criteria. And after this, we had a total of 31 primary studies ready for data extraction. Now, in the next phase, the data extraction phase, we found several semantic duplicates, which we merged accordingly, leading to the final set of 28 primary studies. During the second phase itself, so the data extraction phase, what we did was we extracted relevant data using our design comparison framework shown here. So overall, we extracted 17 different characteristics, which we grouped in 4 different categories that correspond basically with our aforementioned research questions. Now, more details and the corresponding results can, of course, be found in the paper. Now, finally, in the last phase, so after filling in a comparison framework for each paper, we performed content analysis and narrative synthesis to quantify the extracted data and get more insights respectively. So now we're going on to the results. Given that this is a presentation, we feel it's better to combine the results and discussion section. Otherwise, it may feel too disjointed. So here we can see the frequency of the main aspects measured across the set of primary studies. And please note that some papers, around 10, measure multiple aspects. Now, as we can see, the 2 most frequently considered aspects are performance and energy consumption, followed by studies looking at bandwidth, cache performance, and memory consumption. So we can interpret this that the focus of research lies primarily on measuring performance and energy consumption. And in one way, this result is not surprising, right? As these 2 aspects are, of course, very noticeable by users and thus have also a big influence on the quality of experience. However, the quality of experience is a combination of factors, right? Not only performance and energy consumption, the other aspects are important as well. And therefore, in our opinion, more research into these other characteristics would be justified. Now, not accompanied by a plot, but what we observed was that most studies use the same metric for measuring a specific aspect. For energy consumption, joules; for bandwidth, bytes or derivatives thereof. While for performance, we saw much more variety in terms of the used metrics. We even encountered studies that use a more or less undefined performance metric, so it was unclear what was really being measured and how it differed from pre-existing metrics. So therefore, we want to strongly advise researchers and practitioners to clearly define and explain the metrics that they choose. Now, how is the gathered data analyzed, and what about the study's replicability? So in the left plot, we see to what extent the papers analyze the gathered data, and we can observe that all studies use descriptive statistics. So think of plots providing means, maybe a standard deviation. 10 of the 28 papers utilized hypothesis testing to support the findings with statistical evidence, and effect size estimation, which is often used to measure the strength of the relationship between variables, was utilized by 5 papers. Now, more context dependent, but interesting nonetheless, was that 4 studies made use of correlation analysis techniques, and 3 studies basically developed a prediction model based on the gathered data. Now, interesting thing is that when we interpret this plot, is that about 2/3 of the studies do not carry out hypothesis testing. And yeah, this is not worrisome per se, right? As it of course depends on the context and the goal of the study. However, several primary studies draw some pretty strong conclusions, actually make recommendations based on their data without actually informing the reader whether it's statistically significant or not. So yeah, we recommend researchers in these situations to provide statistical evidence to really support their conclusions. Now, the plot on the right, that shows the availability of the replication package across the set of primary studies. And we can see that 20 of the 28 papers did not provide a replication package at all. And when they actually did provide a replication package, we can see that the contents of these packages differ significantly. 5 papers give the reader the code, the data, and instructions on how to actually use these. However, the other 3 just only give the code and data, or even just the code. And the low number of papers providing a replication package is quite alarming in our opinion, as replicability is considered to be one of the major principles of the scientific method. So we definitely see some room for improvement here. Now, regarding the platforms experiments were executed on, starting with the device type on the left, we see that most studies run experiments on a smartphone. Only 4 studies use a tablet. And we also saw 6 papers that use a form of emulation. So for example, using Google Chrome in device mode on a desktop PC. So it looked like that the user visited the website from a smartphone. And this is often done because it enables the use of certain tools for measurements that are only available on desktop computers, like certain browser plugins, for example. Looking at the plot in the middle, we can observe that the most used operating system is obviously Android. Only 2 devices run on iOS. And in the other category, we found 1 device running Symbian and also 1 running a Waymo 5. Now, when it comes to the browsers used, we can see the results in the plot on the right. And the high number of others is basically the result of 1 study which tested a large number of different versions of some pretty unknown browsers. And after that, we can see that Google Chrome is the most used browser, followed by Mozilla Firefox. Also, in 7 papers, a modified browser was used. And this was often done again to make it possible to do certain measurements. Now, when we interpret this data, what's not out is the low number of iOS-based devices, while iOS has actually a pretty big market share on the mobile web. And we can ask ourselves, what are the consequences of this, right? In terms of understanding the performance of mobile web apps on the iOS platform. And how well does knowledge gathered based on Android systems translates to iOS systems? And the thing is that we don't really know. And therefore, we think it's a good idea to do experiments on iOS-based devices as well, even though this may be difficult because of their more closed ecosystem. Now onto the subjects. In our comparison framework, we look at 5 different characteristics here. However, we don't have time to go over all of them. So briefly go over the 2 most important findings. More info can of course be found in our paper. Now on the left, we see that 15 of the 28 studies used real websites in their experiments. So that means not demos, not toy examples, or web apps specifically created for the experiment. 9 papers both used real and synthetic websites. And what we often see is that synthetic copies are created to see how certain changes on real web pages impact their measurement results. And finally, we had 4 papers that used synthetic web apps exclusively. So what they did was they created their own web apps, specifically for the experiment. Now, when using real websites, how do the papers actually choose or select these subjects or websites? And the right plot shows how they do this. And noticeable is the high prevalence of Alexa as a source to select websites from. 14 papers do this. Now, in 6 cases, it was not explicitly mentioned where the website selection was based upon, and 3 others used an ad hoc list. So think of a blog post stating the most visited websites in a given year. Now, interpreting this data, we see a strong dominance of the Alexa list, and the Alexa list provides basically an overview of the most popular websites worldwide, right? And in that regard, it can be considered a solid choice. However, we have to keep in mind that these top websites are often highly optimized, and so the performance of these web pages may not be typical and therefore also not really generalizable. In addition, there is also research that shows that the Alexa rankings can be manipulated pretty easily, so it's also debatable how trustworthy these rankings are. So we should suggest researchers and practitioners to be aware of these issues and act accordingly. There are initiatives like the train call list, for example, that aim to combat these shortcomings of the Alexa rankings. Now, similar to the previous slide, in a comparison frame, we can look at more characteristics here, but I will only go over the most noticeable findings now. Please read again the full paper for more info. And now looking at the scope, so how the experiment tests the web apps, we see that most papers focus on page load only. In total, 7 papers actually experiment with some usage scenarios, and 3 of the 7 papers do both experiments focusing on page load and usage scenarios. So interpreting this, most studies focus on page load only, while in practice, of course, users interact with the page, right? They click, scroll, swipe, and especially today, where there are techniques used to only load resources at the moment of need. So you need some form of interaction before the resource loads. And in such situations, experiments focusing on page load only may not be representative of the actual user's quality of experience. So it would be interesting to see more experiments focusing on actual usage scenarios. However, this, of course, also depends on the situation and the goal of the study. Now the plot on the right shows the network conditions under which the experiments took place, and we can see a clear distinction between papers using real network conditions versus simulating the network conditions by throttling the bandwidth, for example, by using a proxy. Now it can be observed that most experiments use a real non-simulated Wi-Fi network followed by a real 3G network. And finally, we can observe that in 6 cases, the papers did not elaborate on the network conditions under which the experiments were carried out. And this mirrors what we have seen previously, right, with regards to the replicability of some studies. So in summary, we investigated on the state of the art on conducting measurement-based experiments on the mobile web by answering 4 different research questions focusing on the study's metrics and data management, the platforms the experiments were executed upon, the subject used, as well as the execution environment. And we answer these questions by applying a rigorous search and selection process followed by both data extraction and data synthesis, in which we used our design comparison framework to gather and report our insights. Now, among the results we presented today, we would like to highlight again the results found for the metrics, data management, and platforms, as they basically they encompass the factors that we think new studies should take into account, and that is primarily the generalizability. I think, for example, focusing on more platforms or platforms other than Android, focusing on more than page load only, being aware of the shortcomings of certain subject selection sources like Alexa, but also in a more broader context by looking at other aspects than performance and energy consumption, for example. Finally, also the replicability. We saw a low number of studies providing a replication package, and also this lack of detail when describing the experiment's environment, like with the network conditions, for example. So we feel that these 2 things could be improved. Now more details and more information can, of course, be found in the paper. And finally, speaking of replicability, we provide a replication package as well, which can be found through the link below. So thank you.